what's your personal story? How did you put this all together? What was your path?
I'm lucky because I was given an edge into adrenal fatigue, not just adrenal fatigue, but all the endocrine subtleties by my friend and colleague Leo Roy. He was Dr. Leo Roy. He is claimed to be the first naturopathic physician in Canada, and he was a good friend, and he taught me about adrenal fatigue along with high and low thyroid problems and subtle effects of the endocrines. And I saw the adrenals were the most common thing that I saw coming into my practice, and the thing that was people were doing the least about, and that their typical situation was they'd been from 5 to 10 doctors by the time they got to me, and it seemed like the answer was obvious to me. So this went on for a number of years, and I started lecturing on adrenal fatigue, and then as I was going into a lecture at the American Academy of Alternative Medicine, Dr. Wardeen got a hold of me and said, "When are you going to write your book?" And I said, "What book, Ward?" He said, "Well, the book on adrenal dysfunction." I said, "You write it." And he said, "No, you're the man." And I said, "I don't have time to write it." So we went through, he said he thought he could help me with that, and we went through this idea that I was going to hire a ghostwriter that was going to write the book, and we went through 5 of those, one of which suffered severe adrenal fatigue in the middle. And so I finally realized it was the plan for me to write the book, and indeed it was wonderful. The first draft was using about 2,400 references to be the ultimate in adrenal fatigue, to demonstrate to the medical society that this was a real phenomenon, they should pay attention to it. But then my friend Jonathan Wright said, "That's great, but who's going to read it?" And I realized that that wasn't the approach, and so I worked out that we should write it for the people that I loved, and that was my patients. And we wrote it then, rewrote it, and we got it to an 8th grade level, and after 11 rewrites. And I hired a cartoonist from Canada who did the illustrations and the cartoons, and the whole emphasis is to make a book that was made for people with adrenal fatigue. So the print is the size because people sometimes have difficulty focusing with adrenal fatigue.
Their eyes, focusing their eyes?
Yes, because of low blood sugar and the eye is a muscle. And so with low cortisol, it may be more difficult to focus. The concentration's less, often less. Memory is more clouded. Not always, but it's a common symptom. So the whole book, the size of the print, the size of the paragraphs, the level of writing, the cartoons, the lightness of a very heavy subject, the what to do about it is all focused toward the person with adrenal fatigue.
So your adrenals get fatigued, they dysfunction. Can they ever get back up to what they would have been had you not had adrenal fatigue in the first place?
That's the beauty of this syndrome, because you can. It's not really, it's not a disease. So we don't want to confuse it. It's a health condition, I would call it. If it gets into Addison's disease, that's a disease state, but it's not really in a disease state for the most part. So the beauty is recovery is not only possible, it's probable with the right treatment. And I think that's, if you don't get anything else from this interview, if for the people out there listening that have adrenal fatigue, they have to realize they can get better. That even though they've gone for, I've had people with adrenal fatigue for 20 years, they can get better. I had a woman who's 78 years old who was born with weak adrenal glands. And she, after we consulted for only a short period of time, she told me she was writing letters to people she'd known during her earlier part of her life and telling them, "Look, I'm sorry I was so hard to live with. I'm sorry that I was so irritable and so difficult. It wasn't me. I suffer from adrenal fatigue. And now we should get together because I'm a delightful person. For the first time in my life, I'm a delightful person. You should get to know me again."
I'm just sorry she's had to wait till she was 78.
I know, but that gives you the hope. The hope, here's a woman who was born with weak adrenal glands, and she's 78, so she suffered for 78 years, but she still was able to help herself and get back her health at 78. Certainly see in alcoholism, we have people that either start out as adrenal fatigued, and that's why they start drinking, or with the excess alcohol consumption, they become adrenal fatigued with the alcohol. And once they become rehabilitated, then the adrenal program seems to tremendously help any cravings they have for the alcohol.
On into cortisol in your book and explain how the whole symphony of hormones works together. Of course, cortisol is out there in the news a lot as the stress hormone. As you get too much cortisol, it's damaging to the brain. Then we have the synthetic cortisol that you can get shots for. Tell us the story of cortisol and the myths surrounding it. You're pitching it in a whole different light here.
Well, we don't have time for all of that. But
read the book.
No, I don't describe the high cortisol very much. My book mainly is about low cortisol because I thought that's what needed to be hit most. But certainly either too high or too low cortisol is damaging to your system. And the body just doesn't function very well unless the cortisol is in the right in the right
so let's not
quantities.
demonize a hormone. Let's say that they all need to be there in their proper balance,
in
their proper function.
In most of the cortisol levels are not pathologic in the sense they're not caused by a tumor or something else. It's lifestyle. It's lifestyle driven with cortisol and with the adrenals. So in most of those instances, we can get them up, we can get them down through our lifestyle. What we do, by the exercise, by the food, by the thoughts we have, by how our life is conducted, will really affect our cortisol levels.
How widespread is adrenal failure, to whatever degree, adrenal fatigue as you call it?
Adrenal failure is actually a fairly rare event, about 1 in 25,000, but adrenal fatigue is a very common event. Adrenal fatigue affects about 1 in 5 people severely, but it seems to affect 60 or 70% of people over their lifetime. Sometimes that lasts for only a few weeks. Other times it can last for years and years.
So tell us about the adrenals, their function in the body, and what they do for us.
Okay. The adrenals are known as a gland of stress. They're 2 little glands that sit over the kidneys. They're about the size of a walnut. They weigh about the same amount as a grape. And they produce over 50 hormones. Now, those are watered down, or they're concentrated, I should say, into about 8 to 10 major hormones that circulate through your system. And some of those you probably recognize the names of, like cortisol, which is one of the major hormones involved in stress. It's also aldosterone is another one that you may have heard of. Interestingly, the adrenal glands are the chief supplier of testosterone in women. They're the only supplier, except for small amounts coming out of the ovaries. And they're the only source of estrogen and progesterone in men. So as you know, both men and women have both male and female hormones, but the adrenal glands are the ones to provide those opposite hormones for the opposite sex. After menopause, the adrenal glands are the ones that pick it up, and they're the ones that secrete most of the estrogen and progesterone in women. And in men, after andropause, it's the adrenal glands that produce the testosterone. So you can see that the adrenal glands are not only important in stress, but they're also important in aging as well. Adrenal fatigue is a really common thing because the stresses are not just the emotional stresses you were talking about or the social stresses. They're also the physical stresses. They're the environmental challenges that we face, the pollutants. It's the poor food intake. It's the poor quality of things. It's the digestive upsets. It's even the anticipation of stress is stressful. It's blood sugar irregularities. It's any kind of chronic illnesses. Those are all a problem, and they all have to be incorporated into the response of the adrenal glands to help the body balance stress. It cuts across all generations. It cuts across all social and economic, any kind of demographic, any way you want to slice it, has people suffering from adrenal fatigue. But we find there are few kind of groups that stick out especially. Unfortunately, doctors suffer a lot from adrenal fatigue. They're one of the least to recognize it, but they're the one that suffers some of the most. The caregivers, in the helping professions, that's one of the reasons why there's such a high burnout rate in these people. Policemen, school teachers, anyone that it requires a tremendous output of energy in a concentrated form over a number of times, years, those are going to be the people more likely to suffer from adrenal fatigue. And what happens when they do this? Well, it doesn't have to be, I want to say that it doesn't have to be professional also. Soccer moms, women who live their life pedal to the metal trying to be perfectionists about being a wife, a mother, all the other roles that women have to live in our society. Those people suffer from adrenal fatigue too, and unfortunately often are very reticent to admit anything is wrong with them. So people often suffer from adrenal fatigue yet push themselves, and they often push themselves with cups of coffee, with cola beverages, with Jolt, with caffeine, with chocolate, with sugar, with fast foods high in fat and caffeine. And they're pushing themselves because they've started to feel themselves go downhill. One of the first things they've noticed is probably the morning fatigue. In other words, when they wake up, they don't feel rested like they should. They even feel tired even though they've gotten 8 to 9 hours of sleep. Second thing is, they may not even feel wide awake until 10 o'clock, sometimes even 1 o'clock. In other words, they wake up, they feel tired, they don't really wake up and begin cognizant action until about 10 o'clock. Or you'll often hear people say, don't even talk to me until I've had my coffee in the morning. Those are often people suffering from adrenal fatigue. So they're using a false stimulant like caffeine in order to get themselves going in the morning. Another really interesting symptom is that they often have an afternoon low in the afternoon between 2 and 5 p.m. This is when cortisol, one of those chief hormones we were talking about, drops to a lower extent in the afternoon. It has what we call diurnal rhythm. In other words, it's high at certain times of day and low at certain other times of day. And its low point is 2 to 5 in the afternoon. And they'll feel anywhere from just feeling kind of draggy to having to lay down and rest. Then it's an interesting thing, but about 6 o'clock, it's as if someone turned a key on a lot of these people with adrenal fatigue. And all of a sudden they feel better than they felt during the rest of the day. They'll often feel that way after their evening meal or 6 o'clock, and they'll be fine until 9:30 or 10. They often become tired around then, but if they resist for long enough and they reach about 11 o'clock, many of these people, not all, but many, get a second wind, and then they don't want to go to bed until 1 or 2 in the morning. All of a sudden they have plenty of energy and they want to do the dishes, they want to read that book, they want to go do other things. And then about 1 to 2 o'clock, then they want to settle down, and those people then want to sleep in the next morning. So that's the general energy pattern. Now, what are some of the other signs and symptoms that we have with people with adrenal fatigue? Well, they often have problems with hypoglycemia. In other words, their blood sugar becomes irregular. And the reason it becomes irregular is because, once again, this hormone cortisol that we've talked about is a hormone that helps regulate blood sugar. The reason it does this is because it's responsible for converting proteins and fats into the energy that we call glucose that gets into the bloodstream that's needed for by the cells in order to create the energy that the body needs. And when the adrenals are low, cortisol is low, so that means it can't convert the fats and proteins into the reserve energy that's necessary. And so the cells then don't get the energy they need, and people then suffer from low blood sugar. Another one is they may find their thoughts are more confused, especially under stress, not able to think clearly. They may have memory lapses, and they also may find that they lose their temper more often.
Is that because blood sugar's not getting to fuel the brain?
That's right, and they don't have the reserves. Usually there's about a 4-hour, what we call 4-hour glycogen reserve by the liver to handle these kind of stresses. But with stresses, the cortisol has caused a depletion of this because a lot of these people were high cortisol at one time, and now they're low cortisol. So the liver doesn't any longer have its 4-hour glycogen reserve. That makes it even more critical for this cortisol to convert the proteins and the fats into this glucose for the energy, and it's less able to do it. So these people a lot of times don't feel well. They'll walk around with kind of a grayness to them, a general unwell feeling, but they're not sick. Some of these people, in fact, it's frequent for these people to also become ill more often, And if they do become ill, it takes them longer to get over it.
Even something as minor as a cut, you say?
Yes.
If it takes you a long time to heal a cut on your finger, you know
That's right.
something's up.
That's right, and especially respiratory illness. We know that there's a very intimate relationship between respiratory and the adrenals because in premature babies, they lack the cortisol, and